due to the nature of galvanic corrosion, you'll corrode your block. I realized that the sheet metal on this Explorer body is a little too thin for these blind riv nuts. The positive cable hanging out can cause issues. If I yell, stop, then stop. See if it'll try. Hello builders and makers. Welcome back to Build Theory, where I show you my build process in order to help encourage and enable your own projects. On this series, I put a 12-valve Cummins in this tiny little Explorer, and most of the major projects that need done on this thing are done. There's a million small things that need done, so that's what I'm gonna be tackling here. Let's do all of the small things that need done in order to get this engine running in this tiny little Explorer. And then maybe next video we can do all the small things that it needs to get driving. So let's take a look. Now that the steering shaft is involved, I need to run power steering lines so that when I start the engine, I don't just spit power steering fluid all over the ground. I decided to use mostly AN fittings, and I simply adapted the steering box and the power steering pump to suit. Since the return line is a low pressure line, I adapted it to AN and then I just went straight to push fitting on the hose rather than doing an AN hose fitting here. For low pressure, this will work fine. And if in the future I ever modify this, say add a steering cooler or something, this is already AN and will be easy to switch over. The next thing's next, I just need to run cooling lines. So the first two that go into the cab for the heater core so that the car can have heating are pretty easy. I've just got these two hard metal tubes right here, and I just need to plug them in. That's the easy part. However, there's a slightly more complicated part. There's a T fitting in there, and then there's another random hose fitting right there. There used to be an automatic transmission cooler on this Cummins, and there isn't anymore because I went with the manual transmission. So what those lines would do is they would use engine coolant in order to warm up or cool the automatic transmission. I don't have an automatic transmission anymore. I don't need the transmission cooler, so those have been removed, but that means I need to block off these coolant lines. It should be relatively simple to block these off. For one of them, I just have this block off plug and NPT, and then the other one, I have this malleable steel 90 and an adapter that'll help me block it off. The important thing about these fittings is I went with iron on both of these because the block itself is iron. Two dissimilar metals plus an electrolyte, say coolant, makes a battery. Batteries work by reducing the metals, pulling atoms off of them. You do not want to create a battery that pulls the atoms off your cast iron block because that's known as corrosion. So material selection on fittings for this kind of stuff matters. If you go with something like brass or copper, due to the nature of galvanic corrosion, you'll corrode your block. If you go with iron or steel, which is what the block is, you won't corrode anything. And if you go with galvanized, then the fittings will corrode rather than the block. It's a lot better to use galvanized than brass because then the fittings corrode rather than the block, but you'll still have corrosion. The best thing to do is to just use the same material that's in there. So that's what I chose. These are cheaper anyways. Removing this coolant line was significantly more difficult than expected. As you can see, I had to take the alternator off, I had to take the thermostat off, take everything off around it to get at it. And then I was trying to use this big pipe wrench to move it, and that didn't work. It just destroyed the top of the fitting. Finally, I've broken it loose using this screw extractor here. Finally got it loose. So this screw extractor is stamped 13/32, and after removing the alternator, this is the only way to get it off. So if anybody's trying to do this job, that's what I'd recommend is the screw extractor, and don't mess around, just pull this whole alternator off. Now that this is out of here, I can replace it with this plug so that I don't have an open coolant line here. After that gets done, what needs doing is this T-block here. It has a hose going this direction and a hose going this direction. I only need the single hose going this direction. That T-block is going to be replaced with a 90-degree fitting. And at that point, I'll have replaced the fittings with cast iron fittings so they won't corrode. The coolant lines that ran to the heat exchanger for the automatic transmission will be deleted. This fitting, while much simpler, wasn't necessarily easier. I had this crescent wrench on it and then a 24-inch breaker on top of that, and I still had to put a decent amount of force in to break it loose, so that was a very tight fitting. And now it's leaking. Oh man, everything is harder on these big diesels. 3/4 inch MPT, let's swap them. Pipe dope, liquid pipe sealer, would probably be better here rather than Teflon tape, but I don't have any, so that's what I'm using. All right, that's cooling system sorted. I deleted the unnecessary pipes for the trans cooler that I don't need anymore. I ran the soft hoses going into the heater core. Once I put the radiator back on and plug in these two hoses, I'll finally have a cooling system that's actually closed off. Power steering system done, coolant system done. Next thing's next. Let's get some of this wiring sorted out. For now, the major thing I want to get wired is this thing able to crank over and get the fuel solenoid to kick on so that it can start. If you remember from a previous video, I already tested the wiring for this, so I already know where the wires need to go. I just need to actually run them now, so let's get to it. This bit of sheet metal here runs a little too close to the radiator hose. I'm afraid that this rubbing on that is gonna poke a hole in it eventually, so I'm just gonna cut this off with a plasma cutter. Eventually, I might trim back way more of this because I feel like I don't really need any of this, but for now, let's just trim it here. That fits much better without this plate here. This is the stock intercooler piping. This is what runs from the turbocharger and then sends that hot air through this massive heat exchanger, the intercooler, in order to cool it off before it goes into the engine. There's intercooler piping done, and now that that's done, I know where I can actually run my wires without interfering with this stuff. Now let's actually do the wiring that I said I was gonna do earlier. To start running the wiring, I need to figure out where the battery is gonna go. I'm thinking I'm actually gonna put it on the driver's side, and the reason why is because the starter and the fuel cutoff solenoid are both right here, so the things that need the most amperage, this puts it closest to those, and then I can just run a positive wire all the way over to the fuse box on the other side over there. This is the battery box from the original Explorer. And I think I can get it to fit nicely right here. I want to make this battery box bolt in so that I can unbolt it and pull it out if I ever need to get my steering and stuff out. Let's cut up this battery box, see if I can get it to work. So the battery box is gonna have 3 mounting positions. Here, here, and then right here. This third one is just there to add rigidity because this is a little bit flimsy. These two I'm just gonna use normal bolts because they're fine. But on this one, there's some stuff on the other side so I can't just bolt it through. I'm gonna use some riv nuts again. This is a rivet that I can rivet into here that then gives me threads that I can screw a bolt into. However, I have a lesson learned from when I did the floor in the car. When I did the floor, I realized that the sheet metal on this Explorer body is a little too thin for these blind riv nuts, especially a 1/4-20. They start to turn. What I'm gonna do is I made a little plate and I'm gonna have a normal rivet on either side, riveting this plate to the side, and then I'm gonna stick the riv nut through so that I get twice the thickness on the sheet metal. When I did this before, I just learned that the body sheet metal is just a little too thin for these 1/4-20 inserts, but this stiffens it right up, and then I can put a ton of torque on these and they won't spin. All right, I think that'll work. I might need to do a little bit of clearancing on the hood for this negative battery terminal. It's gonna need a custom hood anyways, but frankly, I'd rather clearance the hood slightly than have to move the battery down anymore, because if I move it down anymore, I'm risking getting close to the wheel travel coming up. Right now, I think I have tons of clearance for the wheel, but moving it down, I'm not certain. I think this will work for now. Let's start running some wires to it. All right, so I got 2 major battery cables right here and right here. Those go down to the starter and to the ground on the block. And then coming off the side of it here, I have this other battery cable. This battery cable powers everything in this fuse box here. I passed this cable through here. There's also a ground cable here that goes to the block. And then I covered this cable in this cheap tape stuff that I found on Amazon. I would say this stuff works all right. I'm surprised with the texture it gives. It's actually a really nice fiber texture. Feels pretty good. I'm kind of a fan of that. It's kind of thin. I'm hoping it doesn't come off, but I'll link it down below if you're interested in a really cheap way to do wiring harnesses. I didn't want to do a really expensive wiring harness since I'm just reusing crap off the old Explorer anyways. This is a cheap way to make it look okay. I also got some of this sheathing that I'll use on some of my other wiring that needs just a couple wires in it. You'll notice I did leave this cable here. If I ever end up running dual batteries, this might come in handy, and it's just a ground cable, so it doesn't hurt anything to be there. However, on the positive cable, you'll notice I did cut off the positive one and then just solder the wires straight through, because a positive cable hanging out can cause issues. Negative cable hanging out doesn't really matter. With the major wiring done, the next thing I need to wire in is the fuel cutoff for the Cummins. Remember to always put the covered side of the connector on the power side of the connector. That way, this loose wire can never hurt anything. I find these little label makers incredibly useful, especially for doing wiring. I'd highly recommend picking one up. I wanted to make sure that these wires weren't just dangling, so I made sure to use this abrasive cover that I had bought on Amazon. It worked pretty well for this, it was really easy to use. And not only does it keep the wires together, it also gives them a bit of abrasion resistance while it's at it. The fuel cutoff needed a good dedicated ground. I also needed to run the power for the fuel cutoff to the starter relay so that the fuel will turn on when I try to turn the starter over. Finally, I needed to wire the hold-in coil, which will keep the fuel turned on, into the fuel pump for the car. The Explorer didn't need a fuel pump anymore since I swapped it to diesel. Robbing the fuel pump connector ensures that the fuel will stay on whenever the key is on and turn off whenever the key turns off. Alright, that's all the wiring done in order to get this thing to start and run. Now I need to do the throttle. So this is the throttle cable from the stock Explorer. Where it sits in the throttle cable holder is too small of a diameter, and I also need to add a spacer in order to space this out. In order to make this throttle cable work, I'm just going to make a part of my lathe. This might be a circumstance of when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, but I think it'll be quickest for me to just make something up on the lathe for this. That way I can adapt the Explorer throttle cable in order to work with the Cummins. This long piece of aluminum stock I have doesn't fit through the headstock on my lathe. I'm just going to use a live center in the tail end and then work way out on the end like this. Should be fine with a live center. The next thing I need is 2 diameters. The larger diameter will be too big to fit through the throttle cable mount, and the smaller diameter will slip right through. I cut the part off on my bandsaw so that I can do some of the internal work now. I need a smaller through hole for the throttle cable to slip through, and then I need a slightly larger step hole that the throttle cable will get stopped on. Alright, this is what I've come up with. This smaller diameter slips right into the bracket that holds the throttle cable. The outer diameter stops it from going through all the way. This distance here is the spacing I need in order to get full throttle actuation. The center of the throttle fits through here, and then it stops on that little ledge in there. In order to hold this piece onto the throttle bracket mount, I made a little cutout in there that fits a hairpin. And then in order to hold it onto the throttle cable itself, I drilled and tapped it for a little 832 screw. And there we go. Machining aluminum is just a joy. In my opinion, if you can ever get away with making things out of aluminum, so much easier to do. All right, let's throw this on the car, and then I'll have a throttle pedal. All right, Internet. This is one of those solutions that is a temporary solution, but not a temporary solution that becomes permanent, but an actual temporary solution. Just for this test start. Now, I swear this isn't gonna end in a hood stack, unless it does.
Do I need to do anything?
No, make sure it's in neutral.
This is a tight transmission.
Yeah, isn't it? The transmission's nice. Okay, Internet. If I yell stop, then stop. See if it'll try. Hey, Ron! runs. The Cummins Explorer runs. I can't believe the 12 valve Explorer runs. Today is the next day, and unfortunately, the crappy GoPro that I shoot everything on decided to lose some footage. It still got the most of it, and as you saw, the 12 valve Cummins finally runs, and I am excited about that. It smells like diesel in here, and that's a great thing. This has been a very long time coming. There has been an incredibly large amount of work to get it to this point, and I am absolutely ecstatic that it's working now. In the next video, I'm hoping to actually get it driving now that it's running, but for now, running is a huge accomplishment. I am very excited. This is more than 18 months in the making, and I am absolutely ecstatic. There is so much more to come on this, and huge progress is being made. So if this is something that interests you, then subscribe and stick around. I hope to see you next time, and until then, get out there and build something. Thank you for watching.